Hi, everyone. We're going to get started today. Thank you for joining us and looking at the list of attendees. I noticed that we have a lot of people that attended our first webinar, so welcome back. We're glad to have you. And also a good number of people joining us for the first time. So welcome to you as well. Also glad to have you. So I am Michael Dernwald. I'm an attorney in the Employee Benefits and Executive Compensation Practice Group here at Thompson Hine, and I'm located in the Cleveland office. And I am your host for our Secure 2.0 Deep Dive series that'll be happening every month through November. And we're going to do a little warm up today and give you a polling question so we can sort of understand our audience a little bit better. And so my technology wizard, Scott, is going to pull up that first question. And it should show up in 1 second. And there it is. It's basically a two-part question just to ask you about what percentage of your workforce is part-time and whether you currently allow part-time employees to participate in your 401k plan. And that's what we're talking about, so that's why we're asking. Today we're talking about those long-term part-time employees. It's sort of an interesting combination of two different laws. We have Secure 1.0 and Secure 2.0. And Congress, rather than just overwrite the first set of rules with the Secure 2.0's rules, they decided not to do that. So we have two rules, two different effective dates, and the rules apply to different sets of plans, which we'll talk about. And so just a couple administrative notes while we wait for polling to close. If you want to ask a question during the presentation, you can do so by looking at the upper right-hand corner of your screen and clicking there. And burning question everyone always has is, will we get a copy of the slides? And the answer is yes. You'll also get a recording of the presentation today as well. Please allow 2 business days for that to arrive. And so I think we can go ahead and close the poll and share the results. And let's see what we have. Oh, so we have a pretty decent spread here. You know, I would say half of them, though, do have a limited population, with some more having significant population. Pretty even split about whether part-timers can participate. So that is good to know. And then also a significant portion that would describe none of the above. So we'll take that in mind as we discuss. All right, so there we go. So the presenters, that's me, Michael Dernwald, talking, and I'm happy to present to you Laura Ryan. You'll notice that we have not changed our appearance in the past month. And Laura is a partner in our Cincinnati office, also in the employee benefits practice, and you are in very good hands with her. I can personally attest that she's been answering questions on Secure 2.0 before the law even passed, and she also works with multiple clients that have significant part-time employee populations. So she will be a wealth of knowledge today. And with that, I hand it over to Laura.
Thanks, Michael. And welcome to everybody. Happy to be here again with you this month to talk about this topic of long-term part-time employees. We're going to follow somewhat of a similar agenda that we followed last month when we were talking about the new Roth catch-up feature that we're all going to be required to implement next year. We're going to just kind of level set and review what are the current rules that apply as it relates to this topic to 401k plans. Then we'll address, how are those rules changing under, as Michael said, both and first under Secure 1.0 and then later under Secure 2.0. We'll review a couple of examples just because this is a really, I think, complicated topic. And I think it's helpful to review some fairly basic examples that probably make this look a little bit simpler than it really is going to be to actually implement, especially for those of you that have a very large number of part-time workers in your workforce. And then we will review the steps that you will need to take in order to prepare for these changes that are right around the corner, starting in 2024. So a couple of items on this slide in terms of current eligibility rules. Again, hopefully none of this is new or shocking. These rules have been around and have governed 401k plans for quite some time, but in general, companies have the discretion and ability to define employees who will be eligible to participate in the 401k plan, subject to certain minimum coverage testing requirements. So, there is a limit on sort of how many employees in your workforce you are permitted to exclude based on those minimum coverage testing requirements, which is a discussion beyond the scope of this presentation today. But what does this mean? Well, what it means is that in general, you can decide that you are going to set up a 401k plan that covers your salaried employees, or maybe a plan that covers only your hourly employees, or you're going to have, one plan that covers salaried and a different plan that covers hourly. That's just sort of a very common example of the type of classifications that may be used to determine who's eligible or who's excluded from your particular plan. It might be stated in terms of which of your affiliated entities is employing those employees. Employees of subsidiary A are eligible for this plan. Employees of subsidiary B are not eligible, or they're eligible for a different plan. May also have a plan that identifies folks based on the location or facility at which they are performing services. I mean, there's really an endless sort of array of possible ways in which you might define who is going to be an eligible class of employees that is eligible for that particular 401k plan. The one caveat to that is that the IRS has expressed its view that this classification cannot be what they would consider a service-based classification. It's been clear for quite some time that the IRS views part-time, as a designated class, as a service-based classification. And they probably view, other classifications such as seasonal and temporary as service-based. So that leads us to the next concept here, and we'll come back to that, which is, and again, hopefully this is not news to anybody, but there is a maximum sort of age and service requirement that you can require that these eligible employees, employees in these eligible classes complete in order to begin to be able to, make and receive contributions under the plan. And those maximums are age 21. In other words, you can't require that somebody be age 25 before they're eligible to participate. The most you can require is 21. And the longest amount of service that you can require someone complete generally is 1 year. There are some exceptions that would allow a 2-year service requirement. And in terms of determining when does someone complete 1 year of service, there are 2 different permissible methods that could be used to determine that. One is called the elapsed time method, and the other is the hours counting method. The elapsed time method sort of is exactly what it sounds like. It's just measuring how much time has elapsed since you were hired. And you may have a plan that uses the elapsed time method and has a 1 year of service requirement. And that means that when that person hits his or her 1 year employment anniversary, a year has passed and they would be deemed to have met the service requirement. The other way, the other method of calculating a year of service is to use the hours counting method. And this would actually track how many hours of service you're completing during that year. And if you're using that method, the maximum amount of hours you can require someone to complete in order to be credited with 1 year is 1,000 hours. It could be less. All of these things, it could be lower. In other words, you could have no age requirement. You could have no service requirement, but these are kind of like the maximums, the caps on what's permitted. The second concept to keep in mind in terms of years of service is you can measure a year, what is the period for measuring a year of service? Is it the calendar year? Is it the plan year? Is it the employment anniversary year? Well, you have choices. A plan can specify that the period of service is measured based on the employment year and subsequent anniversary years. So that would really mean that for each person in your plan, they have a unique period of service that's based on their date of hire. And each 12-month period based on date of hire would be what is being looked at in measuring, for example, did they complete the 1,000 hours if your plan has that requirement. There is an option for a plan to provide that after the first year of employment, you switch to the plan year for purposes of measuring a year of service. And if your plan year is a calendar year, that would mean you would switch to a calendar year. But these are all provisions that should be, and hopefully are, already spelled out in your plan documents. They may be provisions that you haven't, focused on in a while, and we'll come back to why that's going to be critical and important as a starting point. The other concept is that the plan needs to specify the entry date as of which the eligible employee who satisfies any age and service requirements becomes eligible. Wide variety of options here. Could be immediate. It could be first day of the month, coinciding with or following the satisfaction of the age and the service requirements. First day of the quarter. First day of a semi-annual period. For example, 1/1 or 7/1 for calendar year plans. But this, again, is a detail that is specified in your plan. Other currently permissible plan design options and eligibility rules. 401k plans can be designed to apply different age and service requirements to different classes of eligible employees. So, for example, it would be permissible to allow all full-time employees to participate immediately upon hire, but require that part-time employees complete 1 year, 1,000 hours of service before becoming eligible to participate in the plan. And I think that is not an uncommon sort of current plan design, especially for employers that have a significant amount of part-time employees. But it can be set up based on different classifications, but you are permitted to have different age and service as long as none of those different age and service requirements exceed the maximum permitted under those IRS rules that we just reviewed. And also 401k plans, the second point on here, can be designed to apply different service requirements to different types of contributions. So this is another concept to keep in mind, especially as we begin to dive into these rules and what they mean. You can, in a 401k plan, you could have various different types of contributions. First, you have, payroll contributions or 401k contributions that employees are electing to make. You may provide for a matching contribution with respect to those contributions. You may also have a employer non-elective contribution, which could be fixed or it could be discretionary. So there's lots of sort of components that could, be part of your 401k plan design. And the point here is that it's permissible to apply different age and service requirements to one type of contribution versus the other. So for example, you could have a plan that permits employees to begin making 401k contributions immediately upon hire, but require that employees complete 1 year, maybe 1,000 hours if they're using the hour count method, before they're eligible to begin receiving matching contributions on those 401k contributions. So it's really important as you begin the exercise of confirming exactly how your plan is going to be impacted by these new rules to get really grounded and familiar with these current rules and exactly how your plan is set up. Okay, so let's switch to what's changing. And this is, with Secure 1.0, as Michael said, Secure 2.0 did not override or supplant the long-term part-time employee provisions in 1.0. They just sort of changed them, and we'll see in 2025. But for 2024, we will be living under the Secure 1.0 rules. And the new rule, and it's in this first bullet, is that employees who have completed 3 consecutive years of service during which they're credited with at least 500 hours of service, we're now going to call those folks long-term part-time employees, must be eligible to make 401k contributions in your 401k plan. That's the new rule. Now, 401k contributions is bolded because, as mentioned in this next bullet, the law does not require that long-term part-time employees receive matching and or other types of employer contributions. So the only thing that the law requires is that someone who meets these requirements for long-term part-time employee, that they be allowed to make 401k contributions, elective payroll deductions to the plan. And this does not, by the way, I just want to be clear, change the 1 year, 1,000 hour rule. It's the earlier of, okay, it's the maximum age in service is the earlier of completion of 1 year of service with 1,000 hours or 3 consecutive years with 500 hours each. Again, for purposes of making 401k contributions.
Laura, just a couple of quick questions here. First, just a point of clarification, this is 500 hours of service each year, right? Not 500 hours for the 3-year period.
No, each year.
Okay. And then second, for our nonprofit friends, does this apply to 403B plans?
403B plans are going to be affected by the Secure 2.0 rule starting in 2025. So hang on, we'll get to that. But through the way in which these changes were structured, the Secure 1.0 changes actually don't affect 403B plans, but you will be affected, just not under 1.0. Just go back one minute. I wanted to make the point on the last bullet, which is if you do decide, okay, to allow long-term part-time employees to receive some type of employer contribution, again, you're not required, but you might decide to do that. Could be a match, could be a non-elective, but if those contributions are subject to a vesting schedule, this is another really important aspect of this rule, those folks must be credited with a year of vesting service if they complete at least 500 hours of service. Okay, just a side note, the vesting service crediting rules work very similar to the eligibility service crediting rules. So, the service period, as well as that rule that you can't require that people complete more than 1,000 hours in order to be credited with a year of vesting service. So those same rules have historically applied to vesting service. So this is, a new twist. We're saying that if employees become eligible under this new rule as a long-term part-time, and you allow them to receive employer contributions in your plan that are subject to a vesting schedule, you have to pay attention to this modification to the way in which vesting service will need to be credited. Another important point is this note, only years of service that commenced on or after the plan year commencing after 2020 will count for purposes of tracking this 3 consecutive years of service for eligibility purposes and for purposes of tracking years of vesting service. Okay, next slide, just a few more points. Another key aspect is that long-term part-time employees, so those people that come into the plan solely due to this new rule, i.e. the 3 consecutive years with 500 hours, they may be excluded from minimum coverage testing, non-discrimination testing, and top-heavy requirements. This is key relief here, because if you have a large portion of your workforce that is going to become eligible under these rules, just based on the nature of those employees, they're part-time employees, they may not, be receiving significant amounts of compensation, and they're likely not to be, take advantage of the opportunity to make payroll contributions, or at least not make very sizable contributions, which would, if they were required to be included in the ADP ACP test, would drag down, the average deferral percentage potentially significantly. So it's important to understand that these folks are excluded from these testing requirements. Now, that's the good news. I would say the bad news about this is another reason why it's going to be really important to keep track of these people and identify, the long-term part-time employees, so that they can be excluded from your test. Okay, your record keepers, the entities performing those tests, you're going to need to identify who are these people that can be excluded from the test. And then another note that this rule does not apply to collectively bargained plans. We're going to move to Secure 2.0. So what's changing effective 1/1/2025? Basically, everything we talked about still applies. There's just a tweak in how we define who a long-term part-time employee is starting 1/1/2025. And that tweak is that a long-term part-time employee is going to be defined as an employee who has completed at least 2 consecutive years of service after 2022. So we are allowed to exclude additional service in applying the 2.0 provisions, during which they're credited with at least 500 hours of service. So remember, 1.0 was 3 consecutive years. Then starting in 2025 under 2.0, it's going to be 2 consecutive years. So more people, will become eligible under the secured 2.0 than were eligible under the 1.0.
And then just, we had one question, and I just wanted to sort of drill the point in on this slide. So the question was, there's sort of a part-time employee that wouldn't meet the 3 years under Secure 1.0, but has the 2 years for Secure 2.0. And the underlying question was, do we have to sort of look back at all the service retroactive to when Secure 1.0 started? And then the answer is no, and it's that because we only have to look at 2022.
Yeah, exactly. And we're going to run through an example that highlights this concept of what do you get to ignore, and we're going to look at it under 1.0 and then look at it under 2.0. So hopefully it'll become even clearer then. So next slide, I just want to again reiterate, there's a lot of things that aren't changing here, and we get a lot of questions like this. Can the plan still apply an age requirement? Yes, that hasn't changed. It's in the maximum age requirement you can apply is age 21. Do the plan's entry date rules still apply? Yes, they do. So, once a long-term part-time employee has met the criteria, they still aren't eligible until, the applicable entry date, whether that's the entry date on which they satisfy it or the next following entry date. But those rules under your plan are going to continue to dictate exactly the date as of which they would become eligible. The plan's definition for defining what is the service period, what is the period over which we're looking to figure out, did they complete 500 hours of service in that 1-year period? That might be the employment anniversary year, it might be the first year, it might be the employment anniversary year for the first year and then flip to the plan year. It depends on what your plan says. And then plans that permit, that permit all employees to elect to make 401k contributions immediately upon hire, or maybe let's say after 6 months of service or 1 month of service, or something that doesn't count hours. So it doesn't matter whether part-time or full-time. Maybe you have some small exceptions or exclusions for collectively bargained employees or non-resident aliens, or there's some sort of typical types of exclusions. But other than those sort of exclusions, everybody's eligible a month after hire. Well, these rules aren't going to affect your plan. Okay, if that's how your plan is designed, you are not going to need to make any changes, because you're allowing already those long-term part-time employees to participate much sooner than this new rule would require. We're going to go to a couple polling questions at this point, right, Michael?
Yeah, sorry. Didn't mean to give a spoiler alert on what's next. But Scott's going to bring up question number 2. This is an easy one. Oh, go ahead, Laura.
First question is, do you think you will need to make changes to your 401k plan in order to comply with the long-term part-time employee requirements? Pretty simple, yes, no, or I don't know. You're still trying to figure this out, and hopefully this presentation takes you one step further in that direction.
Yeah, and the answers are coming in. I can see it dynamically change. It looks like it's going to be pretty close between yes and no. But we'll leave it open for a few more seconds as people think about it. And then while we're waiting for this polling question to close, Laura, just to give you a heads up, we've gotten numerous sort of questions with hypotheticals about applying the Secure 1.0 and 2.0 rules. So when we get to the examples, I think that will answer a lot of people's questions. And then, okay, so let's go ahead and close it. And yeah, still close tie. Although the no sort of took the lead. Okay, so then the next question sort of is based on how you answered that last question. And it's sort of, have you given thought to whether you'll give employer matching or, profit sharing or other discretionary contributions to your long-term part-time employees that join the plan?
Right, and remember, in answering this, as we talked about, this would not be required, but you can always be sort of more generous, right, than what's required, and especially if you have a very small portion of your workforce, let's say, that is part-time, that has historically been excluded. You may just decide that for some, as a result of the additional administrative burden maybe imposed by this new rule, that you're just going to, allow those folks to be subject to, the same eligibility requirements that full-time employees are, and you're going to allow them to, participate and receive matching and maybe even non-elective contributions, because you've decided that the cost of that is sort of small, let's say, compared to the administrative hassle of trying to track these folks and continue to exclude them.
Okay, and we have our results spread evenly sort of among the 3 options. There's a significant number that sort of already gives contributions to their part-timers, but it looks like again the lead is sort of no.
Yeah.
So
okay,
let's take a look at our examples.
Yeah, so the first example was kind of illustrating how Secure 1.0 is going to work. So we have John works for a company that sponsors a 401k plan with a calendar year plan year, just to keep it simple. It has a requirement that employees complete a year of service, and they're measuring that using the hour counting method. So they require that an employee complete 1,000 hours of service during that 1 year to meet that requirement. It has quarterly entry dates, and it uses the employment anniversary year for determining periods of service. This kind of keeps the example fairly simple and straightforward. So John is hired on 7/1/2020 and works the following hours during the following time periods. So as you can see, we're tracking this based on his employment year. So 7/1/2020 to 6/30/21, and then each anniversary. And we've identified the hours that he's completed in each of those. So under the Secure 1.0 rules, John is going to be permitted to make 401k contributions effective 7/1/2024. Now, you might have looked at this and thought, how come he's not eligible 7/1/2023? Because, if we just look at the squares, that would be after he had completed 3 consecutive years at 750 hours or more, with greater than 500 hours of service. But his first employment year is excluded because that year commenced prior to 1/1/2021. Remember, we get to exclude service and service periods that started prior to 1/1/2021. But the concept there is that the rule was new at the end of it was a new rule, and so they recognized that employers were not tracking hours for earlier periods. Now, if we vary this example and we say that John only completes 450 hours during that last year here, the last square to the far right, then he's not going to be eligible effective 7/1/2024, because we ignore the first block, and if he only has 450 hours in the last block, then he only has 2 consecutive years during which he completed more than 500 or more hours of service. So he's not yet eligible based on these details. Now, what if John completes 1,000 hours in that last block, that fourth period of service? He must be permitted to make 401k contributions and receive employer contributions effective 7/1/2024, not because of the long-term part-time rules, but because of the normal service crediting rules. So that's an important distinction. And as I mentioned, these rules don't override the 1 year, 1,000 hours requirement. You have to also be monitoring that requirement in addition to this new long-term part-time service requirement. The next example is for Secure 2.0, very same fact pattern at the top. Here, though, we have John being hired 7/1/2022 and working the following hours over this 4-year period. And note that the second year, he only completes 450 hours. Under Secure 2.0, he's going to have to be made effective, be permitted to make 401k contributions effective 7/1/2026, because he has those 2 consecutive 1-year periods during which he completed more than 500 hours. And that's all it takes now under Secure 2.0, once we get past 2025, or 2024, I should say, once we're into 2025. And note that his first year of employment is excluded in applying the Secure 2.0 rules, because that period commenced prior to 1/1/2023. All right. We are expecting additional guidance that will answer some open questions, and may also just go into more detail about how to apply these new rules. We were hoping to get that guidance before now, but we're not exactly sure when this will come out, but we're being told soon, although we've been being told soon for a while. We do think that guidance is going to potentially address how to deal with individuals who maybe come into the plan under these long-term part-time service crediting rules, but maybe later, change to become, let's say, a full-time employee. So, now they're in the plan as a full-time employee. Exactly when do we determine when those folks might be eligible for the employer contributions if we were previously excluding long-term part-time? How do we credit vesting service for somebody in that situation? Do we flip from a more generous vesting schedule crediting regime to a less generous one? Because remember, the long-term part-time only have to complete 500 hours to be credited with year of vesting. Otherwise plans require 1,000 hours often. And just clarification around, when did those folks need to be included then in coverage, non-discrimination, top-heavy testing. We also are hoping to get confirmation, and maybe some parameters around our ability to continue to exclude employees by classification. We think this should continue. The law doesn't otherwise override that provision, but we want to see what the guidance says and what kind of parameters or limitations there might be around continuing to exclude employees by classification that's not considered, quote, service-based. And maybe we get some guidance on what's considered a service-based class exclusion. And then clarification on how the new rule might impact a plan that covers both union and non-union employees. We know it doesn't apply to a plan that's only covers union employees, but there are many plans out there that cover both, and we just want clarification that I think, that these new rules don't apply to the union groups within a plan that covers both union and non-union.
Hey, Laura, John's very popular. We have multiple people asking the same question, so I'm just going to go back to this slide. And the question is, okay, so he's coming into the plan because he's got the 2 years, that qualifies him as an LTPT. But what happens next year if he doesn't work 750 hours? Is he are the plans obligated to always let him participate as an LTPT, or would he then lose his eligibility because now he doesn't have 2 consecutive years?
I think that barring guidance that indicates otherwise, once he's in, and that's kind of the general rule that we already have, before 1.0 and 2.0. Once you become eligible for a plan, unless you are excluded by class. So for example, if we have a plan that only covers hourly and you change from hourly to salaried, then you're out. But it's not the case that if you come in, just to go back to the old rules, under the 1 year, 1,000 hours, if you don't complete 1,000 hours in your next year of service, you don't come out of the plan. Once you're eligible unless you move to, an otherwise excluded class. So I would suspect, unless the guidance tells us otherwise, that John will need to continue to be eligible once he has met the initial eligibility requirements. We're not going to be able to, remove him from eligibility just because he drops down to 450 hours during the next period.
Great, thanks. All right, so back to the regular order.
Yeah. So what should you be doing to prepare for these changes? This is why we started where we started. I think the first thing you need to do is really review and get familiar with your current plan design and begin to think about the changes that you are either going to be required to make or that you might, consider making, whether or not those are technically required or not, based on these new rules and how they're going to end up applying to your plan and your costs, et cetera. So the first question, I would ask is, does the plan currently apply a 1 year, 1,000 hour service requirement for being eligible to make 401k contributions. At a minimum, if the answer is yes, then at a minimum, you're going to need to make modifications to the way in which you're currently tracking service and hours to ensure that you are also going to pick up, when someone has completed the new service requirement for long-term part-time. Are you going to allow long-term part-time employees to receive company match or non-elective contributions? This sort of assumes that, these folks are otherwise generally excluded from the plan. But as I said, you don't have to give them match or non-elective, but you can. And especially if you don't have many, it may be just administratively simpler to begin to include them if the cost is not great. But if you're going to do that, and if there is a vesting schedule associated with them, then you will need to make sure that you're setting up the methodology to track the 500-hour requirement that applies to tracking vesting service for long-term part-time. You're certainly going to want to gather data about the number of current part-time employees and the estimated number of employees who you think will become eligible to make 401k contributions under this new rule. If you're even thinking about making them eligible for match, you're going to want to consider and identify the estimated cost impact of that. You also should consider the impact on record-keeping fees. If you're suddenly going to have a significant increase in the number of employees that are eligible and may have account balances under the plan, this could trigger, either a decrease or an increase in your record-keeping fee. It kind of depends on the arrangement that you currently have, but many record-keeping fee arrangements, are based on certain assumptions, and a fluctuation in those assumptions can trigger changes to the record-keeping fee. And then, while you're gathering the data, make sure that you are also considering, the data in light of the Secure 2.0 changes in the definition of long-term part-time employees, which, as we mentioned, is going to increase the number because the service requirement is decreasing from 3 years to 2 years. Another point to have on your radar is, does your plan provide for automatic enrollment? These days, I think many plans, have adopted an automatic enrollment feature. And so the question to ask yourself is whether or not you're going to apply the automatic enrollment provisions to individuals who become eligible due to these long-term part-time employee rules. We think that it's permissible to not apply the auto enrollment provisions to this group, because we think that it's permissible to do that now, that you can have groups of employees to which auto enrollment applies and groups to which it does not. This would be subject to guidance telling us otherwise. But automatic enrollment should be on your radar. And if you're going to apply a different rule to this group of employees, you're going to need to make adjustments in the systems that track this and that, apply the auto enrollment feature to ensure it's not applied to, these employees. And although plan amendments are not technically required for either Secure 1.0 or Secure 2.0 until the end of 2025, I think you do need to think about whether plan amendments may be needed in order to reduce the risk of participant benefit claims. Especially if long-term part-time employees are going to be excluded from the match, from the non-elective, from the auto-enrollment features. I just think that you need to give careful consideration whether to do sort of an interim amendment that really clarifies exactly what the long-term part-time employees will be eligible for. The other thing you need to do certainly is what we call partner with your partners. And this slide's going to look familiar to those of you who joined us during your last session. It's really kind of the same story. And you need to be talking with your record keeper. You need to be talking with the folks that manage your HRIS system. If you're going to need to be, tracking hours and you're not already doing that. Identify the changes that need to be made to those systems to comply with the new rules, confirm exactly who's going to be responsible for what, for tracking the new eligibility and possibly the new vesting rules if that's applicable. You're going to want to have time to test the new processes in the systems before they take effect, and establish a game plan to quickly identify and remedy any errors, starting in 1/1/2024. And leave room for iteration and adjustments if needed based on additional guidance. And last, you're going to want to communicate these changes. You're going to have to communicate these changes, to those folks that are going to be impacted by this new long-term part-time employee rule at a minimum. And so you're going to want to consider the timing of the communications, the content of the communications, confirm whether this communication is going to come from the employer, from the record keeper. And this last block is, I think, important as well. It's kind of related to the plan amendment consideration, but you really, I think, do want to take a look at all of your plan's documentation, the websites, plan summaries, even SPDs, safe harbor notices that you may be drafting and getting ready to send out at the end of this year if your plan is safe harbor. And just make sure that based on, the way in which your plan is going to be designed to comply with this new rule, that there's no, I would say, misleading information in any of that documentation, new hire packets and documentation. An example of that is if you decide that auto enrollment is not going to apply to long-term part-time, you certainly don't want to send a packet to a long-term part-time employee telling them that they're going to be auto enrolled. That's going to create, an issue. In order to avoid, confusion, questions, claims, we think it's going to be pretty important to be pretty clear in your communications about these new rules, how they will apply, and what plan terms are going to be applied to the long-term part-time employees who become eligible due to these new rules. I think we had one more polling question that we wanted to throw out here.
Now that everybody's sort of heard what this all involves, sort of curious to see what you sort of think or have planned already, or what you think you'll have to do in the future. And it should, yep, you should have it now.
Yeah, so which best describes your preparation and level of effort for these changes? I hope we don't have too high of a percent that say I have not started the analysis yet, but I'm not going to be surprised if that's the case. Or, you're in process, maybe at various stages, but don't really anticipate a significant level of effort. Maybe that's, because you don't have very many part-time employees, or maybe you've already determined that your plan design is such that no changes are needed. And then the third option is you're in process and you anticipate or already know that there is a significant level of effort involved in planning for these changes.
All right, I think we're ready for the results. And here they are. So Laura, you're lucky, not too many people.
That's right.
Very
Good.
nice. But feel free to call Laura if you don't know where to begin. So it looks like everybody's kind of on top of things and thinking about these. And there's a good amount of people that think this will take some effort. So I'm guessing that you have significant sort of long-term part-time employee populations. So all right, so that brings us then to questions. So first question, this is sort of a nuance on one of the questions you answered earlier, Laura, but going back to the once eligible, always eligible question, the nuance is, what if there's a longtime part-time employee who becomes eligible but does not enroll, then doesn't work enough hours? Does that same once eligible, always eligible rule apply, or would that change the result?
I don't think it would change the result, because that doesn't change the result even under, current rules. The fact that the individuals don't take advantage and don't enroll in the plan. So I think they'll continue to be eligible, and they'll be able to make that election if and when they're ready to do so.
All right.
One thing I just wanted to mention on the hours tracking, and hopefully those of you that are going to need to do some work to do this have already maybe thought about this, but if not, I wanted to mention it. With the Affordable Care Act, hours tracking became pretty important, right, for employers and workers, that were not otherwise, full-time, clearly full-time over the average 30-hour, per week requirement for being considered full-time under the Affordable Care Act. And, with all the reporting, even if those folks are not eligible, you still have to make sure that you're, accurately identifying who the quote full-time for ACA purposes employees are. And so it's possible that you may be able to piggyback off of, processes, systems, hours tracking methodologies that you've implemented for the ACA. Now they're going to be different because, for example, the periods over which you measure the hours, those rules look a little different under the Affordable Care Act than they do under the Qualified Retirement Plan rules. But nonetheless, you probably are keeping track of hours for purposes of the ACA, and you may be able to kind of utilize those systems and methodologies to help you in tracking these hours for purposes of the 401k plan eligibility.
Thanks. And so this goes back to automatic enrollment of the long-term part-time employees. But the listener wants to know for you to share some thoughts on applying automatic enrollment to the LTPTs in a plan that has an IACA or a QACA. You might want to explain those for people.
Yeah, eligible automatic contribution arrangement or qualified automatic contribution arrangement. So the QACA is the the automatic contribution arrangement that meets the safe harbor plan design. So there's a couple different ways you can design your plan to meet the safe harbor plan designs. You can have a safe harbor match, you can have a safe harbor non-elective, and then you can combine the match with a automatic contribution arrangement and satisfy the safe harbor requirements that way. I mean, so the question is, I'm trying to think here. Because these employees are not going to be required to be provided with, to be included in the safe harbor design. They are able to be completely excluded from ADP ACP, excluded from employer contributions, and that includes safe harbor employer contributions. Again, if they're coming in solely based on these new rules. This is not someone that's coming in because they have a 1 year 1,000 hour. Then I do not think that they're going to have to be included in the, qualified automatic contribution arrangement.
Great. Now we have a question about your thoughts on seasonal employees, whether they would be subject to this rule.
I think that they are going to be, just to be clear, you know, it's not, it's even though we talk about part-time and we're using that term, it's not just saying any employees that you characterize as part-time are subject to this rule. It's any employee who, you know, again, meets this requirement, works 3 consecutive years, 500 hours, would need to be made, you know, eligible if they're in a included class. It does remain to be seen. I think, you know, we'd like the guidance to confirm that we could continue to exclude by classification seasonal employees. That's kind of the close call question that, you know, will we be able to continue to exclude by class seasonal? If we can, then they will be able to be excluded and not subject to this rule. But if we can't, then they will be subject to this new rule.
Okay, we're getting close to our end time, so I'll just sort of give you one final question. Do you have any sort of parting thoughts or insights, maybe where you think employers might have a blind spot on this new requirement, or some sort of administrative process that that's not sort of obvious?
I think we touched on a couple of them, you know, things that I don't think people are completely focused on. One is, you know, the impact on record keeping fees. And so be thinking about that, be talking to your record keepers about that. Another thing, when you really start to dig in here, that it becomes kind of a question mark pretty quick, is what happens if, you know, you mess this up, you know, you don't identify and allow long-term part-time employees to make 401k contributions to the plan. What is the correction for that? And, you know, hopefully we all recognize that there is guidance from the IRS about how you correct plan errors. But if you begin to sort of focus on the existing guidance, you quickly realize that the guidance was not written and designed to address corrections for this particular situation and for these types of employees. So I think that we're going to need and want to get more guidance from the IRS, which isn't going to come with, you know, the guidance that we're waiting on any day now, about what is the appropriate correction methodology for sort of fixing these errors, if there is one, you know, when they occur. So it's something to have in mind, but it's not something that I think we have answers for right now.
Thanks. That's a great point. And so with these final few minutes, I'm going to have to sort of close the question and answer period. Sorry we didn't get to everybody's questions. We just had quite a few today. If you want to follow up and you have a regular attorney here at Thompson Hine that you work with, feel free to reach out to them and they can connect with us, or they might be able to answer the question themselves. If you don't have a contact, feel free to reach out to Laura or me, and we'll be happy to try and help you on that. And we hope that you will join us for the rest of our monthly webinars in the Secure 2.0 series. The next webinar is May 31st, and we'll be covering some actually good news rather than an additional burden that we've talked about this month and last month. There are some administrative easings that will help you correct and recoup overpayments. So we'll talk about those as much. If you need to register for those sessions and haven't already, when you get the recorded slides and recording, which you will get in about 2 business days, there are links in that email that will allow you to sign up for the rest of our sessions. And lastly, thank you again for joining us. We really appreciate it, and happy Administrative Professionals Day. Be sure to thank your support. And with that, we are done for this month. Thanks again.